All of those complaints about iPad kids and the internet being a dangerous place. It's not just Karens making noise anymore. All of the horror stories, all of the tales talked about in the chat rooms, and every single warning you've ever heard about people going missing, women being trafficked, and murder for hire happening in plain sight. It was all proven true in 2024. Only Group 764 isn't just interested in clicks and hits. They specialize in children. This deeply disturbing group has been labeled by the FBI as one of the most dangerous threats to our children in this modern day and age. This is the twisted world of BDSM, self-harm, assault of every kind that you can think of, and it's all geared towards the youngest, most vulnerable members of our society. This is the world of Group 764, the internet's darkest corner, and the 17-year-old boy that created the cult that struck fear into the FBI. Let's get into it. Naturally, I have to give a disclaimer here. Most of the cases involve a great deal of violence targeted at children. The crimes committed here are truly the most heinous, most disturbing kinds of content that you can imagine. If you're sensitive to violence against children, I'd advise that you walk away now. Group 764 began as the insane ramblings of a very disturbed individual named Bradley Cadenhead. Before we can even unravel the cult that this has become, we must first look at its founder. Bradley just came out wrong. Originally from Stephenville, Texas, Bradley was diagnosed as nonverbal, but it seems that he just never had any inclination to communicate with the outside world at all. Since he could read and write just fine, he sought company online instead. At 8, he'd already discovered pornography. From there, he graduated to amassing a collection of violent videos that depicted enough torture and gore to get them flagged on any social media platform. Obviously, he wasn't illiterate, and he did start talking well enough to attend school, but the awkward, socially inept redhead was immediately the target of bullies. Bradley always preferred the company online over his peers and seemingly had no interest in school. At 11, he graduated to excessive drinking, self-harm, and threatening to kill his own father, which landed him in a psychiatric hospital for children for a few months. At 13, he threatened to open fire on his middle school, earning him the first official addition to his criminal record. By then, several teachers had filed reports about his concerning behavior. All Bradley talked about was killing people. He possessed a frightening amount of knowledge about constructing bombs, and his increasingly alarming behavior was rendering it impossible for the other children in his class to focus at all. He often showed videos of murder to the other students, not to mention threatening to kill many of them. Just a week after the investigation by police for the bomb threats, he was brought in again because he just continued to post a slew of threats online against the school anyway. In one video, he held an actual gun in his hand and pretended to shoot the screen. The school was going to file charges of terroristic threats against him, but for some reason, they never followed through with their plans. If they had, then maybe the terrible things he'd go on to do could have been avoided. A year later, in 2019, now aged 14, Bradley attempted to take his own life. In 2020, age 15, he was again institutionalized. This time he stayed for 6 months and only left after being prescribed a cocktail of medications meant to treat psychosis, manic episodes, and major depression. He dropped out of high school after failing another year, which would have resulted in repeating a grade for the 3rd time during his overall education. And now it was just Bradley and his computer. He never left his room except to get food and to use the bathroom, and barely spoke to anyone. It's here that Bradley discovered the Discord forum called CVLT. The U in the word cult was exchanged with a V. So I'll just be referring to the group as cult from this point forward. Cult was created by a French guy named Rohan. On Cult, Rohan would lure young or vulnerable individuals via messaging apps and convince them to share explicit photos of themselves with him. After he got his hands on their pictures, he dropped the nice guy act and threatened to release their photos to their families, schools, and workplaces if they didn't comply with his demands. Rohan didn't want money, however. Instead, he'd coerce them into cutting his name into their skins, doing deadly stunts, taking their own lives on camera, and he even orchestrated the demented actions of a man named Caleb Christopher Merritt. The 21-year-old drove all the way from Texas to Virginia to kidnap and assault a 12-year-old girl who wouldn't cave to Rohan's demands. So this was the kind of environment where Bradley finally found a community that was exactly as deranged as he was. But he decided that he'd rather have his very own little community to commit the atrocities he had running around his head for him. He went on to create Group 764, named so after the zip code he happened to live in. His group did everything that cult did, only Bradley added animal torture and specifically targeted only underage victims. It exploded. Kids were talked into sending nude photos or videos of themselves in explicit positions, or exes and terrible friends sent photos of people they wanted to get back at, completely without the victim's knowledge. And then the threats started. Preteens and teenagers desperately killed their own pets, cut profanities into their chests with razors, or just about anything that Bradley, who went by the username Felix764, demanded of them. Within the group, people openly shared content of children between one another, not just of a pornographic nature, but also videos involving extreme abuse and even murder. They live streamed torturing animals on screen, practicing self-harm, and of themselves indulging in illegal substances to audience that egged the filmers on. I need to reiterate here that Bradley was only 15 years old, and he'd set up this horrendous get-together on Discord in such a way that people were flocking to his page, essentially doing the work for him. Not that he was sitting back doing nothing, mind you. He and the moderators scoured Facebook, Telegram messaging apps, Reddit, Minecraft, Roblox, any space where kids talk to each other. They were there to recruit them or to find vulnerable children who had thoughts about self-harm and ending their own lives. Once they befriended them, swindled damaging content out of them, 764's community would pounce on the kids. Their demands started with self-harm to killing their pets, all the way to taking their own lives, with hundreds, sometimes thousands of sickos just like Bradley tuning in for the show. The page had transcended just sharing violent content and extorting young people for their very lives. There was now this volatile group of individuals that lorded over the smaller, weaker members that they kept in line with more threats. And at the top of that pyramid was their founder, a 16-year-old redhead that never left his bedroom, their boy king that had total control of his minions, each one just as sick and twisted as he was. And that's the crux of the problem here. There were so many of them that rifling through the hundreds of suspicious accounts popping up in group chats, online games, Discord, and Facebook, it was hard to discern who was behind it all. Authorities became aware of 764's activities about a year into their reign of terror, but it would take them another year to figure out who was preying on kids who were only there viewing in the background, which individuals were sharing what was clearly illegal content, and most of all, who was in charge of all of this. 764 was no longer just a discussion board for teen anger and spooky occult symbols. It was a cancer that had metastasized into a global network, and the more they dug into it, the worse it became. What started as a hunt to find predators sharing photos and videos with each other had now turned into an investigation into a full-blown cult. Look at the facts. 764 drew children to them with promises that their anxieties and feelings of isolation would be cured by finding a community that understood them. Then, through harassment, violence, extortion, and coercion, they'd be isolated from their peers, parents, and anyone they might have asked for help, until they felt they had nowhere else to turn to, forcing them into a form of virtual slavery where the price of keeping their shame from their parents, schools, and friends became more and more violent, until the blood and the pictures were no longer enough. Payment became sacrifice, the sacrifice of their pets, their bodies, and eventually their lives. Kids carved the name Felix into their arms, their chests, and their legs to appease the forum's leader. When the group started actively planning riots and public displays of violence, their fantasy suddenly had the potential to spill into the real world. Of the 13,000 reports that came in of sextortion and violent threats coming in from the group, authorities could only isolate 250 of those with physical means. You have to realize that the perpetrators were all virtual. They were scattered all over the globe, completely hidden by firewalls and encrypted messages that rendered them invisible. To name some of these cases, a 17-year-old German teen affiliated with 764 murdered a 74-year-old woman on video for the group. A 14-year-old in Sweden attacked elderly couple in a series of stabbings, also by the urgings of 764. And nearly a dozen cases of kids taking their own lives, their bodies already riddled with brands proclaiming Felix 764 on their skins. Not to mention hundreds of thousands of videos and images of children in compromising positions. Worst of all, 764's ideal victims range between the ages of just 9 up to 17. In September 2023, the FBI issued a nationwide warning about Group 764, the child exploitation organization that had ballooned into frightening proportions, urging teachers, parents, and any institution working with kids to be on the lookout for activity from the group. But this too led to nothing. It was the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who'd been investigating 764 since its inception a year and a half ago, that finally made the breakthrough. How they traced the Felix handle to Bradley Cadenhead is a secret they're not telling, but they were able to track him to the very street he lived on, a feat that the FBI had failed to accomplish. Their tip led to Bradley's electronics being seized and his eventual arrest. And the discoveries they made in those computers were enough to send every officer on the case to therapy for the next few years. It's not just that he had a library's worth of content stored on the worst atrocities known to mankind. He was in the middle of extorting preteens for nude photos as the police broke down the door, and he admitted to everything on the spot without a hint of shame, regret, or fear for where he was being taken. Some of the top sergeants of this vicious group were traced through Bradley's computer, and with the help of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, so far 5 men have been arrested in connection to the group. 19-year-old Cameron Finnegan of the UK got 19 years for encouraging or assisting ending one's own life, possession of a terrorist document, possession of indecent images of children, and criminal damage. John Rocker, a 19-year-old Florida man who had the largest collection of child content of all the defendants, including infants and toddlers, received 7 years. Angel Almeida, 23, from New York, got 15 years for much the same, only he was arrested with an unregistered firearm, allowing for a longer prison sentence. Then there's Leonidas Varayanis, a 21-year-old from Greece, and Prasan Nepal, 20, from North Carolina. Besides the same offenses as the others, they were also charged with operating a child exploitation enterprise. Both of their trials are still upcoming, but they're looking at life behind bars if everything goes as it needs to. And what about their leader? The founder, who they referred to as a god, Bradley Cadenhead. He was brought in under charges of child sexual abuse material, possession of videos of minors being coerced into self-harm and degrading acts, orchestrating abuse through the 764 network, and 9 counts of possession and promotion of child sexual content. All at the tender age of 17. Bradley was given 80 years behind bars. The only reason he didn't get more was because he pleaded guilty to every single one of the charges against him. Let that sink in. 17 years old, Bradley must be the youngest and most brutal cult leader in the history of the world. In a year and a half, he managed to create a network of abuse, death, and horror that spanned across the globe. And I hate to say it, but the main ringleaders being arrested hasn't put a stop to the 764 cult. Several of the previous followers have gone on to create groups of their own, where they're doing the same thing. Only now it's even worse, because there are more of these predatory networks out there than ever before. As we cut the head off one beast, it's gone on to sprout several more. Bradley Cadenhead could still be sitting next to your kid in class. He could be working in the stall next to you. He could live right next door. That's the lesson here today. No one and nowhere is safe. The world is full of nondescript, everyday Joes that look like everybody else, old, young, or even just kids, men, women, and everyone in between. And how can you know what horrors they have planned for you and your kids going on in their heads? In a world where truth hides in plain sight, we follow the shadows. If this case left you questioning everything, hit like, subscribe, and drop your theories in the comments. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your evidence obscured.